My name is Miguel Mendez. I work on the Google Web Toolkit, and I'm also the shepherd of the GWT project, which is the Google API library for GWT. So if this is supposed to be an introductory discussion today, so if at any point along the presentation you want to ask a question, please just come up to the mic and ask your question. We don't necessarily have to wait till the end to do so. Okay, how many of you guys are familiar with the project, the Google API library for GWT? Anyone used it? Okay. All right, well that's sort of the focus of this discussion today. Okay, so basically I thought I'd give some overview on the Google API library for GWT project. Then I thought we could actually just move through and look at, just at a high level, the different APIs that it currently supports, and then just how you might get a few tasks accomplished within each one of those APIs. And again, like I said, if at any point you have a question, don't hesitate to just come up to the mic and ask it, and we'll deal with it as they come up. Okay. So the GWT project is an open source project. Basically, the project is a collection of GWT bindings for existing JavaScript APIs. You wouldn't find brand new APIs there. That is to say, you wouldn't find APIs in there or bindings in there for which there isn't already a JavaScript API available. Basically, we take each API and we create a standalone distribution for it. So any of the APIs that I'm going to talk about today are available for download from that project, and they're just individually contained. You don't have to use all of them. You can just pick the ones you want to use. Each API comes with a set of JavaDoc, the jar file that contains everything that GWT needs to be able to interoperate with it, and some sample code. And some of these samples that I'm going to have up here actually come from the samples that ship with each API. The idea is to make it pretty easy to consume these JavaScript APIs from GWT. So, the pattern in 90% of the cases is really just, if you're familiar with GWT and GWT modules, you just inherit the necessary GWT module that defines the wrapper for the JavaScript API that you want to use, and you make sure that the corresponding jar is on the GWT class path. And that's the bulk of it. So currently we have support for Ajax Search, Gadgets, Gears, and Maps. And we actually have Milestone builds available for all those, which you can go to the project and download and try out. Okay. There is another side to the Google API library for GWT project, which is it kind of touches on a few different ways that you can have GWT interoperate with existing JavaScript APIs. So, you've got your standard containment, and by that I just mean you declare this Java class, and somewhere inside it has a field that is the JavaScript object that it's talking to, and then basically all the calls delegate through into that JavaScript object. There's also another technique that's fairly prevalent. If you look at the Maps code, which is based on the JSIO. Are any of you guys familiar with the JSIO project? It's Google API Interop. It's a fairly advanced little piece of code, but it allows you to do some fairly interesting things like extending JavaScript objects in Java. And you'll see that technique used a lot in the Maps API bindings, for example. And lastly, there is direct use of JavaScript object. Actually, Bruce Johnson is giving a talk at this very moment that goes into a lot of detail on that third item on the list. But suffice it to say that in GWT 1.5, we allow you to basically declare types that overlay a JavaScript object, which basically result in zero overhead. So it's not containment, and it's not JSIO crazy marshalling. It's literally you describe a Java type, extends JavaScript object, and you basically get right down to the metal. And when the GWT compiler compiles that, there is no wrapper. You're literally talking directly to the underlying JavaScript object. So anyway, those are some of the interoperability techniques that are used as part of the GWT project to make all this go. So the first API that we have support for is Ajax Search. And that's, basically your stock Ajax search as you would expect. So you have blog search, book search, local news, video, and web search. And we tried to go for a pretty easy setup for the Java version of the API. And we'd like to try to make it difficult to get wrong. So it's actually just a pretty simple set of steps to get them up and running. Basically, have any of you guys used the JavaScript Ajax Search API at all? Okay. All right. Basically, you have options. You configure the options, and you create the search control. You add it to your page, and then you can start executing requests against it. So what would that code look like? Well, here's a very simple example of how you would use the GWT bindings for Ajax Search. If you're familiar with GWT, you could literally this could be the simplest Ajax Search enabled GWT app that you could write. In your module load, you create your options. To the options, you just add a web search. That means that whenever you ask the search control to execute a search, it'll do web search. You can also add blog, news, all that. You can add as many searchers as you want. Once you have your options configured with the searchers that you want, you create a new search control, do that, add it to your outer page, and then just for fun, you can execute an initial query. And that populates pretty much the way that you would expect it to in the JavaScript API version. For the most part, we try to maintain a high degree of fidelity between the JavaScript API and the GWT bindings, although sometimes we change that up if we think we could do things in a more foolproof way in the Java version. Okay, so that's one very simple use of the Ajax Search API. There is another option that you can use, which is search listeners, and that's the case where you're executing these requests and it's going to the search control, but maybe you want to do some kind of left-hand nav pane type setup where you want to sort of look at the requests as they're coming in before they're drawn into the main control and save them off maybe as a link or do whatever you actually want to do with that result. So in that case, you would use a search listener. And again, this is part of the JavaScript API. This is just the way we expose it for GWT. So again, you would, do your search control based on some set of search options that you've already set up. You create a new search listener, and inside that search listener, you do whatever it is that you want to do with a particular result type. So in this case, I just cared about web results. So anytime I see a web result, I can go off and do any special handling that I want. And then lastly, you can see how to add the listener. Does this all seem pretty straightforward? Is this kind of what you guys expected to get here? Is there anything else you'd rather talk about? Questions, comments, complaints, criticisms while we go? No? Okay. All right. So anyway, that's just yet another technique, and that's basically the Ajax Search API support that we have. Pretty stock. Okay. Gadgets. So as part of this latest iteration on the GWT project, and thanks to the linker work that went into GWT 1.5, we actually added gadget support for the Google API library. So that means that you can actually declare a gadget written in GWT, and basically that functionality is just part of the GWT project now. How many of you are familiar with gadgets? Written them. Cool. Okay. Try to write them in GWT prior to this? No? Okay. So anyway, basically, again, this is still all pretty simple stuff. We have this gadget class now that's part of the gadget support, and you literally just extend it, and that basically expresses the intent that you want to create a gadget. Now, each feature that a gadget wants to access is modeled via an interface whose name is needs followed by the feature name. So basically, in that case, your gadget then would extend the gadget class and implement as many of these different needs interfaces as it wants in order to fulfill the behavior that it wants to expose. And there's an example that I'll get into here shortly. Now, I do want to point out that you can use GWT RPC from a gadget. The only trick is that you have to use the intrinsic feature, and the intrinsic feature has this get cached URL call, where you basically pass it the URL that you would want the RPC to go to if it were not a gadget, and it returns to you basically a proxy URL. And then from that point forward, you could just have your gadget make RPC calls if you want. And that's not restricted by the same origin policy, because this functionality actually sends it back to the server of origin, and it deals with the redirect at that point. Excuse me a second here. I'm not sure what I hit up here, but I seem to have lost the screen. I had something down here, I believe, but in the meantime, does anybody have any questions? No? Okay. All right, there we go. Thank you. Right. So anyway, basically gadgets in the way we've done them for the Google API project leverages GWT code generators and linkers, which is a fairly in-depth talk. If you didn't see Bob Vodder's discussion yesterday on generators and linkers, it's definitely worthwhile going to see. But that's how we make all this stuff go. Yes? Oh, okay. Well, have you gone to iGoogle? Oh, okay. Sorry? Oh, sorry. The question was, what is a gadget? What makes it special? So if any of you have gone to iGoogle, it's basically there's sort of like little widgets that you can drop onto a page, and they have different levels of functionality. Some implement to-do lists, some have weather, stock updates, all those types of things. But basically, a gadget, if you're able to create a gadget, then you can publish that to any gadget container, things like OpenSocial and iGoogle. Shindig, I think, is another example of an available open source. So gadgets are pretty cool. You don't have to build a full-blown website. You can just create your little gadget, publish it, and people can consume it. And so gadgets really only make sense in the context of a gadget container, which iGoogle is one example, Shindig and OpenSocial. Those are all gadget containers in effect. Okay, so what does this all mean? Well, that basically means that to define a gadget, you basically define a couple of different things. You can define your preferences. So like if you want to have a gadget that remembers user preferences, This is how you would do it. You declare your version of a preferences interface, and it exposes attributes, so like an alert prompt, and its default value is hello gadgets. You can say that it's required. You can also have, basically these preferences can be of different types. Strings, booleans, whatever makes sense for your app. But basically this is how you would define a mechanism by which your gadget can be configured on a per user basis. And then with that, you are able to actually define a gadget. And this is what I was talking about, where you basically have a gadget. It extends the gadget type that we have provided as part of GWT. And that basically expresses that the gadget has my gadget preferences. And then for every feature that it needs from the gadget container, it implements one of these needs interfaces that I had mentioned earlier. So in this case, we need intrinsics, and we need the ability to save our preferences. So we implement the needs intrinsics, needs set preferences. Each one of those interfaces implements a single method, which is initialize feature. So then, and lastly, there is the init method. So basically, this is the simplest gadget that you could create using the gadget support in GWT. And so what ends up happening is we play these little different tricks in order to have a GWT module basically start up, call initialize feature for every feature that you want, and then call init with your gadget preferences. So basically, this is the simplest gadget that you could create. Does anybody have any questions on that? Does that make sense? Pretty simple? Okay. Pardon me, would you mind stepping to the mic so we can hear? I can't hear you. No. So GWT 1.5 is one thing. And then we have a separate project, which is the Google API library for GWT. That is a separate thing. It is just leveraging the new features in GWT 1.5 to provide this additional functionality for you. Does that make sense? Okay. You familiar with GWT? Okay. So just let's take a step back then. Put this all in context. So GWT allows you to write Ajax applications in Java. So instead of, breaking out Notepad or your editor of choice and putting together these .js files, you write Java code. That Java code gets compiled via cross-compiler to produce JavaScript code, obfuscated, optimized, small JavaScript code. And so that is what GWT does. Now, there's a lot of other things in GWT. For example, hosted mode debugging. What does that mean? That means that if you use GWT and you're writing your Java code, you can actually single step through your Java code inside of your IDE of choice. Now, in this hosted mode environment, we're actually driving a real browser. So, you could actually have an HTML page that has a button on it, and you can set a breakpoint on the on-click handler for that button. So that's sort of the big picture view. And really, what this support is about is basically allowing people to use that environment to access these different existing JavaScript APIs. So Gadgets is really like a specification for a container and a set of JavaScript APIs, and that's kind of how we got here. Cool. Yes?
Is there something equivalent to hosted mode if you're doing gadget development with GWT?
There is. It's subtle, but basically you have to compile a version. So it's not as seamless as we would like it to be right now. However, you can actually compile your gadget, right, to JavaScript, push that into the gadget container, deploy that to a Gadget container, and then use a advanced feature, a hosted mode, which is no server. And basically that allows you to hook into the debug process. It's just that we don't, as part of the GWT project, we don't redistribute a Gadget container. But if we were to, then it would be even more seamless. Would you mind stepping to the mic for a second? Sorry, there's like a fan back here. It makes it a little difficult for me to hear.
So can I use any standard web server as my Gadget container?
Yeah, I mean we don't dictate that. So you could use Shindig, you can use iGoogle.
Tomcat?
Well, Tomcat is a servlet container, and a Gadget container is usually a servlet itself.
Okay, can I use my BEA, my WebLogic?
That should be fine. Any other questions? Cool. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, how do you persist? How do I persist it into a database? It's managed by the container. The container, basically, the preferences API passes your preferences off to the container, and the container stores it in whatever way it wants. So as long as it meets that contract, it's an implementation detail of the container. Does that make sense? Okay. So we talked about Ajax Search and the support that we have. We talked about gadgets and the support that we have for that in GWT. Next area is gears. So we actually do have GWT bindings for gears that are part of the GWT project. And they expose everything you would expect, the database, local server, worker pool. We did do a little bit of a value add thing here, which is we've actually provided a offline module. And what's particularly interesting about that is if you have your GWT application and your GWT application chooses to use the offline capability, we will automatically generate a managed resource store manifest for you. And that basically means that you can take your application offline with a single method invocation. So you don't have to worry about building up your manifest. If you've done that, it's kind of a laborious process because you got to list every single file or resource that your application uses. And if you're using GWT, you'll see that there's these strongly named files, and it's impossible to predict what their names are going to be. So it's kind of a nice little feature. We also provide a rebind property as part of the Gears API support. And if you saw Bruce Johnson's presentation yesterday on deferred binding, this might make more sense. But if you didn't, the basic gist is in GWT, you can basically have different versions of your application effectively for free, which means that if you want to use the Gears functionality, you can basically say, use the Gears version of my app if it's available. If not, use this other version of my application. So we provide a rebind property for you. An interesting limitation to point out is that currently you can debug Gears applications in GWT's hosted mode, but only on IE. And that just has to do with the way we have these hosted browsers that we derive from hosted mode. But we are working on something called out-of-process hosted mode. Suffice it to say, it should remove that restriction. And lastly, you cannot debug worker pool workers. That's because they're completely isolated. They can't access the DOM. They can't access an external object on the browser to let us know they're up. But again, that's something we're working on. So anyway, that's sort of the high-level Gears overview. We could take look at a couple of examples of how you would use the Gears API that is included in GWT. So the first one would be just how do I create a database and store a value into it in this environment? Well, it's pretty simple. We literally have a database class. You instantiate it and you tell it the name of the database you want it to have. Then, you can just use the straight execute method on the database object. So you can basically have it If the demo table doesn't exist, create it. And if you do create it, here's sort of the layout that I want for you to have. And then you can execute insertions against the database. And then lastly, you close it. So you could use this type of pattern to actually have information that persists in the client, in a Gears-enabled client, across application reloads, which is, one of the interesting things about Gears. And you could also imagine that you could build more complex functionality on top of this, like, maybe you're actually synchronizing databases between the client and the server, or, even between a worker thread or a worker pool worker and the main and the front end of the application, for example. Now, this is what I was talking about for taking your application offline. So this is sort of one of the things we did that we thought was value add, but it seems to be pretty useful for people who want to create offline GWT applications. If you want to use this, all you need to do is inherit the offline module, which is part of the Gears API now, or part of our Gears bindings. And that basically will trigger the linker, a GWT linker, to produce this managed store manifest for you that contains everything that your application needs. And then in your application, you just literally call offline.getManageResourceStore. And that'll basically get you a resource store that has the proper manifest applied, and it has already triggered the synchronization of your app. So once this thing completes, once this method completes, your application is actually ready for offline. Pull the Ethernet cable in, you're good to go. So that's the Gears offline capability. So now we can talk about maps. Now, before we go into maps, does anybody have any other questions about the Gears bindings? Sure.
Yesterday in the Gears code lab, we needed to create a little method to check if we are online or offline, which fired an XHR request to the server to see. And then depending on the result, we knew if we were online or offline.
Sure. So you're doing like a polling thing?
Right, yeah.
Okay.
So is there anything already integrated in GWT Gears integration that tells me if I'm online or offline?
No, we did not integrate a poll, but you could build that using GWT's request builder, which is basically the way you do XHR. Just promoting. It would be nice if that just happened automatically. You know what I mean? Like if there was just instead of having to do the poll, but you could easily build the polling in yourself. But then you're making the conscious decision that you're going to add load to your server to handle that ping. But so you can do it. You can still do it. It's just that now you need to make the conscious decision that that's what you want to do, and that you're willing to tolerate the additional load. Yes.
Hi there.
Hi.
Yesterday I learned that Gears supports mobile devices, which was something brand new for me.
Sure.
So I don't know an awful lot about how you would do that, but would you say that GWT is an applicable technology to use to build a Gears mobile application?
Yeah, I would think so. The only caveat is that each mobile browser is slightly different, so we would just have to make sure that we work with the particular mobile browser that you're interested in. But actually, we've written mobile applications for the iPhone, for example, using that Safari browser. So I haven't tried it, but I would expect that the probably one of the newer versions of Mobileye would be fine.
So you would just write a Java application and build it using the Gears toolkit the way you showed here, and then that should be it?
Right. So you would actually need to build your application using GWT.
Yeah.
Compile that to JavaScript, put it on a server,
yeah,
and then the particular mobile browser that you would want to use would have to have the Gears plugin
got it.
installed. If you want, we could talk about it in a little bit more detail offline. But
thank you.
Yep, no problem. Any other questions on Gears before we move on? No? Okay. So maps. So actually, we've also added the ability to create GWT applications that use the Maps API. I actually think this is kind of one of the neater integrations, just because we actually have to do a few crazy things to make it all work out right. But basically, we actually do expose the Maps API to the GWT developers. There's a couple places where we have cleaned up the API, like, if you create a map control and you don't set the center on it, you can't technically call methods on it. Those types of things. So, we added a constructor that takes the center, and so when you instantiate a map control, it is fully usable. There's not any of these little weird error conditions that you could get into. Other things we did was we actually allow you to add GWT widgets into the different map controls. So you'll see a couple of examples of that, but just the simplest one would be, how you have info windows? Well, now you can put GWT widgets in your info window, so you can have, our tree control, or, buttons, or, different panels if you want. Other things that we did, which I thought were pretty cool, actually, where we allow you to interact, to basically extend the Maps API in GWT. So if you're familiar with the Maps API, it actually, declares its version of what it thinks an abstract control is. It has overlay and map types and all those types of things. Well, we actually went through a little bit of extra work to make sure that you could create custom map controls in GWT and add those to the map control in JavaScript. In order to do that, we needed to use a more advanced marshalling technique, but it can be made to work. And then lastly, I just wanted to point out before we go look at the code samples that when you're using the Maps API, you do have to, be aware of the Maps key. And have you guys familiar with the Maps API and the Maps keys and all that? Okay. If anybody isn't, I could talk about it some more, but okay. Not terribly, terribly important. Okay, so what is the simplest Maps-enabled GWT application that I could write? Well, here it is. So basically, you could just, inside of your module loading GWT, you can create the map widget, and this is what I mentioned about making sure that it's usable. So if you create it and you don't set the center, we pick a default center for you, but it's good to go. You can add a small map control to the map widget itself, set the size of the map widget, and then add it to your root panel. And so if you were to actually look at this application, it would be a GWT application, and in the center you would see a map control, and you could click it and drag it around and zoom in, zoom out, all that type of stuff. So it's just a trivial, Maps-enabled GWT app, but that's what it allows you to do. Does that make sense? Everybody? Cool. Aha. Hey. Sure.
Explicitly to root panel in order to render, or can you put it in another panel and then add that panel to root panel?
Yeah.
And it will still render.
So this map widget is a GWT widget.
Perfect.
So it has the same constraints that it does. So if you want to put it in a panel and in a flow panel and that'll work.
Excellent. Thanks.
Yep.
Another question: in order to enable these different modules, do you inherit the module within GWT, and/or in this case you mentioned adding a script tag to your outer HTML? What's the methods to actually get this enabled in the GWT environment?
So there's really usually two things that you'll need to do currently. The first one has to do with what GWT considers to be a module. Are you familiar with that? Okay, so basically a module in GWT defines the set of code that the compiler needs to be able to cross-compile to get to JavaScript. So it's like saying, this module will define the set of types that it wants to have cross-compiled into JavaScript. So the rules of inheritance kick in there as well. So your application will actually have a module, and that module just needs to inherit the maps module, and that gives it access to all these map types. There's an additional constraint with maps that you have to basically request the JavaScript API and pass the key. And because of that, the easiest way to do that and not box people in is just to have them put it into their outer HTML. So that is sort of the general pattern. The only exception to that is Gears, because even though Gears has a JavaScript file that's associated with it, you never actually fetch it from the server. that make sense? Cool. Yes.
So you can't get the Maps JavaScript API via I think it's the Ajax API loader?
You could.
You could? Okay.
You actually could. If you do that, you just have to be aware that you can't start, instantiating map widgets until that API is loaded. But you certainly can do it.
Okay. I have another question.
Sure.
A lot of new functionalities get released by the Maps API team, and perhaps they aren't contained in this project. You haven't accounted for them yet. What suggestion do you have for those of us who would like to start using those functionalities right away within GWT?
Sure. The best idea, we're an open source project, so like all these APIs that I'm talking about are actually exposed in a Google Code project, and I have the URL at the end of the slide. You'll see the URL for it. But send us a patch. Create an issue in the issue tracker and attach the patch. Actually, the Maps API releases almost on a weekly basis, in effect. So look at their doc one day and come back a week later, and there's more stuff there. We try to hit the things that we think are really important, of broad appeal, but if we miss something that you're interested in, raise it as an issue, and then if you have a patch that enables that feature, that's great. So that's the nice thing about being an open source project. You're not technically, we're not constraining what you can do. It's like start from here, and if you want to make it better, if you want to add things, you totally can do that. Okay, so remember how I said you can actually create custom controls? Well, this is a very simple example of how you could create a custom control using the Maps API that we provide. So in Maps, there is actually a control class, and we call it a custom control in this case. And you literally just define a class that extends the custom control, implements the necessary methods, and you just add that to your map widget. And now your control is actually on the map, and you can interact with it. In this particular case, we just did a simple control that is a button, and when you click on it, it zooms in on the map. And you can basically extrapolate from there. But you can see that we get the map widget, we create a flow panel, which is a GWT widget. To that, we add a button, and then we add a listener for that button, such that when somebody clicks on it, we just trigger the map zoom behavior. So that's it. It's actually a pretty simple control, but you could do this. And you can debug it in hosted mode. So you can put breakpoints in the initialize or is selectable or even in the on-click and actually step through your code, so you don't have to try to debug that in JavaScript, although you certainly could. So that's custom controls. Overlays are basically a very similar thing. Again, you just declare a class that extends overlay, satisfy the contract, and you're good to go. I left the code out because it actually, drawing rectangles and all that stuff, there was just a lot of code. Made the slide a little dense, I thought, but I think you get the idea where, it's what you would expect to do in Java, but it just turns out that we do tricks to make sure that this overlay is usable from the JavaScript API. So does that make sense so far? Everybody good with that? Okay. So that's pretty much sort of the presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you guys might have, but before we do, just real quick, we do have milestone builds available in the project, so if you go, you can actually download the latest milestone builds for all these APIs that I talked about with the functionality. And the project is the GWT Google APIs project. So do you guys have is there any questions or other areas that maybe you guys would like to discuss?
Hi. So I understand that this project covers several of the Google APIs, but what if I want to work with, say, Google Ajax Feeds API or the language API that's not covered by this project?
Right.
What should I do? I know you can use like native calls to JavaScript methods. Can we do something, can we utilize that to utilize Ajax APIs that Google provides?
Yeah.
How would you do it?
How would I do it?
Yeah, how much work is involved?
I don't think it's a lot. I mean, it depends on the complexity of the API. Like gears is pretty simple. Maps is a lot of work. So I think it depends on the complexity of the API. But I would probably start off by asking one question, which is this JavaScript API that I want to expose to a GWT user, is it intended to be subclassed in sort of in a JavaScript way? If it is, then you're kind of looking at the maps route, and you can look at our maps implementation to see how we dealt with that. If it's not, if it's literally just interacting with it like gears, you can actually do that pretty easily. You know, you could literally just declare a class that extends JavaScript object. You use JSNI, which is basically GWT's way to have Java code called directly into JavaScript code. And basically, you just create a delegator like that. If you use the extends JavaScript object type solution, you get the tightest, smallest, fastest possible exposure. And of course, you're always welcome to commit it back to the project. And if you go to GWT, the Google Web Toolkit contributors forum, you know, we talk about the GalGWT project there. So if you had an idea or an API that you wanted, or you had a patch that exposed a particular API that you wanted, you could bring it up on that forum and we could talk through it. Yes.
Okay. First of all, thanks for the talk and thanks for the project. It's great, and I really would like to use it. And that leads me to my question. So we have our web application now that already uses an existing Ajax framework. And so now I would like to integrate a GWT widget or a subpage that is written in GWT using gears or the maps tool. Would you recommend just rewriting the whole front-end client, or do you think it's easy to integrate part of the a new part of the application written in GWT?
I think it depends.
Of course.
It's certainly, GWT is not an all or nothing proposition. So I would probably try to find natural boundaries that I could sort of separate out into individual islands of functionality and then convert those and integrate those back.
Okay.
So I think it depends on your application. If you want, we could talk about it a little bit more offline.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, just find me after the presentation. We'll talk about it. Hello?
I had a question. Some of the other Google libraries like threading and concurrency, and then also some of the Java graphics libraries like JAI and Java 2D.
Okay. I'm sorry. Is the question like, do we plan on exposing those?
Yeah. I like, for example, can I spawn multiple threads and have multiple things running?
I mean, you can with worker pool.
Okay.
So that basically is the closest thing to threading that you'll get on the
worker pool.
On the device.
And then, like the Java 2D, you can draw primitive shapes and such like that, and JAI lets you do image processing. Are any of those exposed?
Java 2D itself, or do you mean
like
the Google charting library?
Well, so in Java you can draw boxes and lines
Sure.
and stuff if you use the Java 2D library.
You wouldn't in the browser.
You wouldn't.
Right, but there's other techniques for drawing things on the screen in a browser. There's that's definitely not my area of expertise, but I do know that there's this thing called Canvas, which is available on some browsers. There's SVG that's available on other browsers. We have, as part of GWT, we have experimented with a way of trying to put together a homogeneous facade around those different implementations on the different browsers. If you wanted to get more detail on that, you should probably hit the contributor forum, the GWT, what we call GWT, and you could get a lot better information than I can give you about it.
Thank you very much for the talk.
Right? You're welcome. Yes, sir.
Hi, I have a question about GWT and App Engine. I would love it if GWT was supported on App Engine today, but it's not, and I assume you cannot tell me exactly when that might happen. But if I want to take the first step and host my own GWT application, but use App Engine as the data store, is there a way to do that today?
I mean, GWT just produces static files. Like, there's not anything special that needs to run on the server per se. So you could take your application. If you're not using GWT RPC, you can just compile your application to JavaScript, and put that anywhere you like. And then it's a matter of if you want to communicate back to the Google App Engine, how do you do that? So you'd probably be looking at, I want to move objects between the client and the server. What does that look like? And there's libraries that can help you with that. We just don't have an out-of-the-box solution right now. Is that?
Thanks.
Okay.
Actually, my question was related to that. I was just going to ask if you were doing any work with the two teams. But for the gentleman who asked the question before, there's actually on code.google, there's a RPC Python library. So you can use it straight out of the box using that at the moment. But is that something that the two teams are planning on working on together?
I think it makes sense. It's like, I think Bruce Johnson said it best. It's like peanut butter and jelly. You can imagine these things go great together, and we certainly want to do that. I don't have a time frame.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yes.
So how easy is it to dump the gadgets into like OpenSocial? Like, can you use GWT to develop gadgets that can be run in OpenSocial?
Well, probably the best way to get a sense for that is just to go download the Gadgets API, the Gadgets bindings, and try out the Hello Gadget sample.
In the GWT library? Or
Yeah.
the GWT APIs library?
In the in the GalGWT project.
Yeah.
If you, the only tricky thing there, like I said, is that you're going to have to basically compile it, get a version to it in the container,
Right.
and then use no server. If you want, again, hit the contributor forum, and we can help you through that.
Perfect, thanks.
Yes.
Hello? Okay.
Yep.
Sorry. In Maps, there's, I don't know the behind-the-scenes stuff that the Maps guys do with getting all the content onto the browser. I think HTTP request is used with the images, the image tiles, but with geocoding and the network services, I think the route finder, I can't remember the names of the classes.
Directions, you mean?
Yeah, G-directions, that's it. Those require some asynchronous calls to the Google servers, and I think, I'm not positive, I think they expect the call to be coming from the domain where the site key is. So what I'm wondering is, can we test geocoding and G-directions from our hosted browser? Is it possible?
Yeah, you just have to be, you're going to have to replace the key.
Okay.
But you could actually have two different modules, and the only difference is the key that they want to use. So you could have one for hosted mode and one for production.
Okay.
And you can make that work. If you look at the Hello Maps example, in the Maps bindings, it actually has examples of directions and all that type of stuff.
Okay. All right, cool. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question about the widgets, the gadgets and communication among them. Is it possible to have gadgets kind of listen to each other's events and take actions, or is that not part of the framework?
That's not part of the framework, and I think they're sort of meant to be isolated by nature. Just by their very nature, they're meant to be isolated. Now that said, if there were anybody that I could think that could envision a way to make that work, it'd be Ray Cromwell. He's got a presentation at 3:00 today, where he's going to talk about some crazy GWT linker tricks and stuff. But you might want to ask him. He might be able to give you a better beat on it.
So right now, if I have, say, a map gadget, and I want, upon clicking on a city or something, to take some action, there's a way to do that, right?
Oh, in the Maps binding, yes, but
I
sorry.
can pass that information to another widget that user clicked on this map, and this is the information that you need to kind of...
Well, so let me make sure that I understood the question. So the question is, I thought your original question was, can I have gadgets talk to each other?
Right, so clicking on, say, a city on a map gadget can generate an event by that gadget where another gadget is listening for that particular event.
I don't think that'll work out of the box. If you're talking widgets, then that's totally possible. But different gadgets,
Gadgets, yeah, really. I mean,
I don't think that is actually meant to work by design. But you might be able to bring some kung fu in there and make it work.
thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions? Anybody? No? Okay. Well, I appreciate your time. Hopefully you enjoyed the presentation. And if you have any more questions, just feel free to look me up. Thank you.